Hello and welcome to the Space Between Ideas. I'm Blind Gates. Today is my first weekly wrap up video. And why is it that we're doing a wrap up video? It's because um, the thing is that behind the concept of what I'm trying to build here is a deeper methodology. And the deeper methodology is set in some concepts that were developed by Dr. Thomas Buchholz. So I want to just go through my thinking here for just a minute. A minute, une minute. So let's see. Let's see if we can see what's going on over here. Probably put this on the side of the screen. All right. So I created this thing I call the Endeavor Cycle, based on some of Tom's work. So I created this online course, and it's you can do better by thinking better, and thinking better means developing thinking tools and techniques. Now, if you have thinking tools and techniques, then that means that like you should probably start to use them. We've been talking a lot about calibration. I've been calibrating my liaison and my architect, and now that since I've been doing this work quite pretty consistently now for a little while, and we've created our little 10 o'clock into Tbilisi situation, so that we're doing it, every day basically. Um, we need to go back into the methodology and make sure that what we're doing is actually working. This is the first idea that I teach, which is the corporate menu, and it's that every company has some roles that need to be filled. So we have something in here where we have some hands. Hands include the technicians. I would say the technician is the person who's actually, in this case, it's the person who's actually writing the code, and then we have the clerk, which is producing the foundational documents. Then there's the librarian who is managing the, because I have the Notion page, I have the Google Docs page, and then also there's some backend services in the Google Gemini, which manages documentation. So the whole process of using documents and then using getting the AI to produce software based on those documents and some of my prompts. That's all kind of in this area here. Next, we talk about coach and analyst. So on the one hand, I have provided my document inside of my documentation. We have some thinking frameworks, and that is inside the documentation. So there is the question here: is can we improve our I call it calibration? Can we improve our AI instance calibration by adding more thinking tools within our documents? So, for example, if you want to calibrate a liaison, or if you want to calibrate an architect, then the question is, what kind of thinking frameworks do you have inside to help Gemini or whatever ChatGPT or whatever you're using? What kind of thinking frameworks have you added within that documentation to help that AI to make decisions? For example, I know that I have um, this specific the app that I'm actually building. I also have these questions inside of my documentation, so I can ask the liaison or Gemini or architect to actually go through one of these modules, and then that will help it to structure its thinking. I also know that within the documentation we have something that's called well, it's I think it's maybe in this one. It's based on that Eric Anders idea of um, deliberate practice. So it has this concept of deliberate practice inside of the documentation. And so that's the question: is are you using thinking frameworks within your prompts so that the AI is responding to you with a certain type of thinking methodology? And because maybe Google or ChatGPT, it doesn't necessarily use the thinking framework that you want. Then we go down to the analyst, and then the question is, to what extent are you analyzing? So, like, when your analyst is working, see, there's kind of a flow here that you have to see. For example, let's start with the technician. The technician's doing the service. The question is, what is the work of the clerk? What is it based on? The work of the clerk is actually based on the technician. So depending on what type of work the technician is doing, then you have these auxiliary functions that are provided by the clerks. And then now, when the clerks are using their hands to do the work that they do, then the question is, who's providing the auxiliary function for the clerk? And that's going to be the librarian. Now, when you have this group of people who are using their hands to produce the service, to do the service or produce the product, to provide the auxiliary documentation, to provide an environment where these hands can legally operate, and also that the back end services are provided so that these guys can focus on just doing their product or service, then on based on and then also having a storage of all that information. Next question is going to be what? So then the analyst is going to look into the hands and it's going to ask, okay, so what is happening? And what do we have to work with? So they're going to go and they're going to talk to the technicians and say, okay, so how are you actually doing your work? You're going to talk to the clerks. How are you doing your work? You're going to talk to the librarians. How are you doing your work? Now, after they finish querying the hands, then they're going to start to think about these questions: what can we do? How can we do it? And how sure are we about the decisions we're making? All right. So, what does the analyst produce? What is it that they produce? The analyst does not produce decisions, because look, the decision making process is in this column. The analyst is simply producing a piece of advice. They're going to advise on what we can do, meaning in this area, what are things that we can do. Now, you might be saying, well, what about sales and marketing? Yeah, well, sales and marketing. So every company, they have the person who's doing the service or production, but then they also have the people who are doing some specific departments. These are like roles. They can also be applied to different departments. So you could also say that the marketing department is doing a service. I don't consider marketing as the core. It's when you have a company, remember that a company is always three things. It is it's the actual product or service, and then it is the medium where that service is being presented to the public. You could also call that logistics. And then finally you have the sales. So you have the offer. All right. So one human being, they are finding customers. One human being has to get that product to the customer, whether it be by putting the product in a showroom, or whether they put it whether it's a brick and mortar showroom or whether it is an online showroom. In either case, that is the medium for logistics. And then you have the production side. So you could say that anyone in sales is also a technician, and then you have to have some clerk functions who are supporting the sales function, and then you have the librarian function who's also supporting the sales function. Then you have the technician who's producing the code, or laying the bricks and doing the renovation and producing the physical infrastructure. And then you have the clerk processes behind that. Then you have the librarian processes behind that. So the analyst, it could it could look at any of those three areas, or it could look at other auxiliary areas that are related to these things. And in any case, what they're doing is they're trying to provide some changes to our procedures. And then they also need to talk about how sure they are in making those changes, and how what kind of effect they'll have. So finally, you go back to the manager, and the manager is going to understand the advice given by the analyst. I mean, generally speaking, you could say that the analyst is not actually proactive. You could say that the manager, because the whole point of this process is that the manager is going to be talking to the analyst and saying, hey, so what do you think about what's happening? And what do you think about, like, what are some changes we could have? And then how sure are you about that? And then once these functions have provided all that data, then the manager will then start making some decisions. The decisions are going to be based on how how to better manage people and processes with infrastructure. So it's about people, it's about profit processes, and it's about infrastructure. That's pretty much all we got going for us is people, processes, and infrastructure. So then the manager is going to tip off to the executive and say, okay, so here's all the ideas. And then, okay, and then the executive says, well, here's our vision. So based on our vision, uh, do you need to talk to outside sources of information to verify what the analyst is saying? And do you need to go deeper and talk to those specific people on the team to find out if to verify that data and then make that decision? And then finally, the manager makes the decision. Once the manager makes the decision, they're going to go back into the coach and maybe the analyst, and then they're going to provide some situation where this new framework can be applied to these these uh, these lower levels. So it's basically a cycle. It's a little circle that goes around and around. All right, so there's me, there's liaison, there's architect, then there's these IDEs. And the question is, what's going on there? So we got the IDEs that are actually producing code. We got liaison. And so liaison and the IDEs are technicians. And then sometimes I ask them to produce the clerk function. And then with the librarians is Notion and Google Gemini. And then also there's also librarian functions within the IDEs. There's also some librarian function within Gemini. Then sometimes I ask, so architect is sometimes the analyst, and sometimes I ask the technicians to play an analyst role. But when you take it depends on your level of analysis. So if I try to take one step outside of what's going on, I move out and say, okay, so I've done a ton of work, and maybe it's not a ton of work for people that have been in the industry for a lot of years, but for me, it's been, quite a bit of work. So can we start to move back and take a helicopter view of what is happening? And can we think about what are we going to do next? And are we going the right direction? Are we doing the right thing? Is what we're doing really an improvement for what we've been doing in the past? I've made some changes to the documentation, and I don't want to talk about that necessarily right now, but I made some changes to the gold standard concept. And also, I want to allow the IDEs to have a little more autonomy to produce different sets of code so we can actually figure out which IDE produces code the best and can do my project. Now, all right, so this is the full document of my course. And what I really want to talk about is this document over here. But before we get to this document, it's better if we understand this this endeavor cycle. So what happened? When you talk about a weekly wrap up, why are we doing a weekly wrap up? It's because what we want to do is we want to recognize outcomes. If you look at the black boxes, you can see that the question is, what do you want to do? And whenever you ask this question about what do you want to do, the first thing you want to do is you want to look at, well, what is being done currently? What are other people doing? How is it being done? And then you're going to take inventory. So, which is like, okay, so what do we have to work with? And once we understand what we have to work with, we can make a map of the terrain. We can map out what is it that we have to work with and what are some potential opportunities for what we're going to be working on. From there, we want to figure out ways to optimize inventiveness. If you look into my app concept, then what we're doing here is we got the vision, and then when we go down to this optimize inventiveness, then that's actually what kind of checks this off. So taking inventory, mapping the terrain, optimizing inventiveness, all of this can be handled through that one function. It's in Tom's book, Create Crucial Insight, it's called state inventiveness. By going through this process, eventually we're going to create a route. And once we have a route, then we're going to question the assumption, which is, we're going to double check the assumptions that our planet are built on. And then finally, we are going to make some decisions about what kind of impact we want to make. And based on all of those different models of how to think about the problem, then we're going to start to perform the actions, right? And then once you perform the action, then the question starts to be, okay, well, what do you want to do now? Let's do it again. So then we're going to recognize outcomes. So we're going to look back at the actions that were performed. We're going to see what kinds of changes have been made in the taking the inventory. We want to see if there's any changes made to the map of the terrain. We want to plug in our inventiveness again, and then create the route for the next series. Make sure that none of the assumptions have changed, or monitor how assumptions have changed. Discuss what kind of impact that you want to make. And finally, you make a decision and you perform the actions. All right. So you can see I've shown you two different loops. One loop is within the business itself, about constant improvement, about how we take the data from the bottom level roles and then we put it through these level roles. We make some decisions and then we structure the decision and then apply it to the system. And then the second idea is using this endeavor cycle pattern to talk about what are the actual steps to going through that process, from not rather than a personnel perspective, but a process perspective. Now, whenever I talk to new students, we always go through this. This is the very first document. It's called Game Pieces. After they go through game pieces, then we want to start talking about the game, the flow of the game. And really, the flow of the game is, this is what I just showed you. It's basically this. This is the simplified version. What do you want to do? So we're talking about the potential. And then when we think about, well, what is potential? So then we go back up here. Potential, according to Thomas Buchholz, is the ability to guide interactions, the ability to involve resources. Now, once you have some AI resources, then they're already excited. The thing is that you don't have to excite an AI resource. It's already proactive. I mean, to some extent. And so it's mostly about guiding the interactions between these AI. I think that's the key that everyone's trying to focus on right now, is how do you guide the interactions? And I've seen a little bit of technology, I've seen a little bit of change, and we're all kind of experimenting with this process of how we guide interactions. Of course, it's quite simple. There's two different paths that you can go down. When we talk about vision, then we're talking about, well, these are Tom's endeavor elements. So we're talking about potential, meaning like, okay, so you have something that's possible and there's something that you desire. And so that's the idea of a vision. It's a combination of your desires and what's possible. Once you've established your vision, so when I say the word potential, one way is to say vision, but then what the vision of what? Well, it's the vision of what kind of interactions are you going to be guiding? What kind of motivations are you going to be exciting? And what kind of resources are you going to be involving? And so it's all really based on what resources you have access to. Once you can define the resources that you have access to, then you have to kind of look intrinsically. You have to look at yourself. You have to see how motivated are you to make some change to that resource. And then also, do you have the ability to guide some interactions? Are you able to motivate the people that are involved in those interactions in order to manipulate those resources and achieve the thing which you want? So the question is the hypothesis viable? The hypothesis, of course, is the vision, but it's more than just the vision. Is there an actual plan involved with that vision? And then, so that's at that point, you have to start looking at case studies, evidence, and historical data. And the last question is, are you testing or are you working with a proven strategy? Okay, then you got to run the play. So this is the game flow. I call this game flow. This document is called game flow because I talk about what are the forces, the elements at play. In the first document, we talked about what are the actual game pieces. If you're playing the game of chess, then the question is who is in the game? How do you actually play the game? You talk about the pieces. But then, okay, but now we understand the pieces. But the question is, how do those pieces work together for a specific vision? Because when you start to combine the pieces together in a chess game, you have different types of game flows. Finally, we get into game strategy, and a lot of game strategy is based on concepts like deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is your ability to identify the categories related to a certain type of process. When you want a certain type of result, meaning like, well, if we go back and we talk about vision, so first thing you want to focus on is what kind of potential do you have related to guiding your interaction? The question is, how can we improve our ability to guide interactions? Next is, how can we improve our ability to excite motivations? And finally is, how can we improve our ability to involve resources? If you just focus on those three things, or one of those three things, okay, so here's guiding interactions. So I can focus on my ability to improve my calibration documentation. Number two is excite motivation. I think I'm super motivated right now, so I wouldn't worry about that too much. Also, my AI resources are super motivated right now, so these two are definitely working out pretty good. Involving resources. So now this is about discovering new resources and managing current resources. Like I showed you in my video just earlier today, I was able to build like a closet for my clothes. I just pulled some resources together, and this closet appeared. Now, as just like on the internet, I pulled my Notion and I grabbed my Google Drive and I got my Google Gemini and I got my cursor and windsurf. I pulled all these things together. Got my MacBook. I got my internet connection. I got my crappy microphone that I dropped my computer and bent the wire. Got all these things. I got my goody gourd, and all of these things are different types of resources. So as I start to develop my experiences and my abilities, then I'm going to have bigger and bigger visions. And it's always going to be about, are we running a proven strategy or are we testing a new strategy? Is the hypothesis viable? That comes together by, we have to combine things. For example, if you're playing football, you're going to be combining physical fitness, ball handling, and spatial awareness. Those things can be broken down into subcategories. These subcategories, you can't necessarily design an exercise to develop these specific subcategories. They're almost as general as the main category. So you have to really focus on the exact elements. What are elements where we can design practice exercises in order to develop those specific elements, and then those elements will improve categories. Categories will improve your general ability to do that thing. So we could identify, for example, guiding interactions, right? So what do you need to do in order to guide the documentation for your working with AI? I'm not going to answer that question today, but maybe you want to do that for homework and say, let's say there were two or three or four very specific categories for how you could improve your AI. What are those categories? All right. So, number one is your ability to help the AI to explain to you what's the best way to structure your prompts. All right. So, we got prompt structure. Number two is like how to manage the tokens and what types of processes that you are using within your tokens and how to update your documentation before your tokens run out. So this is token management. Right? So you got prompt management, you got token management, and finally, what's the third one? So prompt management, then that can break down into some subcategories, and token management can also break down into some subcategories. And then what? So then the third one is probably intra intra AI relationships. All right. So how do AIs work with other AIs? So if you can optimize your ability to create prompts, optimize your ability to manage tokens and document updates, and also figure out how to optimize the ability for different AI instances to work with each other, you're well on your way to extremely having uh, extreme advances in your ability to guide your AI interactions. And if you can increase this, you're certainly going to increase your potential. Because we're working with AI, then we don't actually need to worry too much about motivation. Finally, it's resources. Okay, so I don't want to talk about resources today. So that's one of the different ideas that's in the world today. Another is OKR, and I don't necessarily want to talk about OKRs today, because I feel like when we talk about OKRs, then what we're really talking about is people who have what? Who already have an agenda. Once you have an agenda, then it means you have a clear objective. You know where you want to go. This is similar to my app here, where, okay, here. So, is it, do you have an objective in mind? Yes, describe the objective. So, when you go directly to this section, it means you already have an objective. And if you already have an objective, to some extent, you can go directly to your Monday.com or your ClickUp. You don't necessarily need my app. What's the benefit of my app? Yeah, of course, the benefit is that if you already have objectives, then you're going to have like a project page where you can manage those projects. But you can also do that inside of ClickUp. So the benefit in my app is actually, if you're not exactly sure what your objective should be, then you're going to use Thomas Buchholz's work here to think through that having a little problem solving experience. So OKR methodology is good for people who kind of already know what they're trying to get. Now, for people who they're not quite sure what they want, you're going to start with the Arthur Anderson's um, deliberate practice. That is one methodology for understanding the elements required to improve your overall skill. But cube thinking is something else. Cube thinking is something that is similar to these ideas. Cube thinking is like, well, I need to break down processes. Processes are really important to me, but how do I break down a process? And usually, what you want to do is, instead of like describing the objective from an OKR perspective, you just write down the thing that you want to do. Like, what is it that I need to do? Because sometimes objectives are hard, because an objective is generally like a SMART goal. It has to be specific, and it has to be able, and it has to be able, and it has to be arable, and it has to be teable, whatever those other letters mean. Okay. But if you just say, okay, let's do cube thinking, it's okay. So what do you need to do? Well, okay, we're planning on going to we want to enjoy our trip to Rome. Okay, that's much easier, right? It's very specific. I want to enjoy my trip to Rome. Well, then I need to decide on the locations for the trip. I need to figure out how many days I'm going to be there. I need to plan the hotels and restaurants. I need to buy the tickets. I don't know how to do any of those things. Okay, no problem. Let's just break it down. So, for example, the first one, if you want to decide on locations, then you can go into like search on Google TripAdvisor. All right. So I kind of, what I probably need to do is I need to write a script for my calibration tools that discuss the concept of cube thinking, so that we can have a better breakdown, particularly for architect, so that architect can break all these different problems down into smaller pieces. And in fact, we've done that. So in my sprint documentation, we have a very, very clear outline of all the sprints and all the steps that we need to take in those sprints. I have no idea if those choices and if those those processes are correct, or if it's just all craziness, because I let AI make all those decisions. All right, so we've talked about some of that. All right, so we talked about game pieces, we talked about game flow, and then when we're talking about game strategy, I'm talking about two thinking tools: cube thinking and deliberate practice are two tools that can really help you to pin down the ideas that you really need. All right. Now, how does this relate to recognizing outcomes? Because this is kind of where I wanted to talk about with my weekly wrap up. How it responds to weekly wrap up is connected with Tom's work, and it's this thing that I produced from his work, which I call the Buchholz Drive model. This is kind of different, slightly different than the chapter in his book Create Crucial Insights, because I've combined them in this type of structure. Now, if you look at his book, you can see that he actually had this intention the beginning, but uh, I don't know. He didn't lay it out exactly like this. What does this mean? Everything in life is based on two different things. Like right now, we're talking about like what's going on in Europe, what's going on in China, what's going on in America. I can tell you the number one problem in these socialist countries, for example, Europe, the number one problem is socialism. Now, what do I mean by socialism? Why are you saying socialism's bad? Well, I'm not saying socialism's bad because I'm going to define what I mean by socialism. What I mean by socialism is that what's going to define the future is two things. One is going to be the ability for a country to produce energy. And then number two, it's going to be their productive capacity. Another way to define the word productive capacity is to use the word capabilities. And once we start using the word capabilities, we're talking about level of success, right? So, capability is an ability, it's a skill, it's a knowledge, it's a behavior, it's a method, it's a competency. And I would say that maybe better than this, we can use the word productive capacity. Productive capacity. Now, I think that productive capacity is also what we talked about in this thing. So, your potential is really your productive capacity. What's going on in Europe? The problem in Europe is that there's so many people who are incentivized with public safety nets. And I'm not saying that a public safety net is necessarily the wrong decision, but I'm saying that there are cases where public safety nets and money that goes to people it doesn't necessarily incentivize people to be more productive. And I think that we really need to focus on the policies that can help people become more productive. I could say that during my life, I've had very productive and very unproductive periods. And currently, I'm enjoying a productive period. And when I look around, I can see that there's some, if we find some gauge for productivity, we're going to see that the countries that are able to harness their energy and productive power are going to be the ones who have the brightest future. All right. So, what we want to do, what happened in America and some of these European countries is they started out as I don't know where they started, but likely they started somewhere over here. They had a low level of ability. Humankind had a low level of success, low level of knowledge, low level of behavior, low level of message. And then suddenly, they had some breakouts in different areas of technology and science, which means they started to master the concept of developing processes. Once they were able to master the development of processes, they were able to get better and better outputs. So what happened is some group of people they started to be able to increase their level of effort. They also started to increase their level of success. And now as you start to use tools, then what happens is as you use tools, you'll notice that you can apply the same level of effort. And in this case, it just basically means the amount of time, how much focus, how much grit. Like, for example, with me and grit, you can see that this week I had some serious challenges, but I just kept pushing myself. And even when I was tired, I wanted to do other things, somehow I just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And we were able to successfully complete the problem we were trying to solve that we ran into sometime in the middle of this week. All right. And then I added the hours and I was extremely focused and I was able to put in an appropriate level of effort. My level of skill wasn't necessarily that high, but I was able to, with the use of artificial intelligence, I was able to harness, leverage the ability of artificial intelligence in order to give me a relatively high level of skill. And so, perhaps something that would have taken another person a lot longer, it took me less time. Certainly, without AI, I wouldn't have been able to do this task whatsoever. So, what happens is I'm currently in the striving area. With the addition of artificial intelligence, it's able to push me up into the competing area. So I'm currently competing in areas that I've never competed in before, and I have some particular skills and abilities and knowledge that other competitors don't have, and other competitors also have some skills, abilities, and knowledge that I do not have. So the question is, over time, is my ability to use AI going to give me strengths that some of my competitors uh, do not have? Or, in other words, are there competitors that their main strength has been doing processes which will be replaced by AI? Or do I have particular skills and behaviors and methods which will be more easily replaced by AI? So, if I have access to your competitive skills, but I have some additional, some competitive advantage, some dominance hierarchy, is there something that I have that will allow me to reduce my level of effort and still achieve the same, though I'm not putting in the same level of effort, meaning I can begin to focus my attention on something else? I still recording. And if I start to focus my attention on something else, maybe it's another competitive adventure to make my life more interesting. I don't know. Maybe it's another competitive venture to beat my competitors from different angles, right? So if I have suddenly have three hands and I punch you, and then there's another punch coming from behind you, right? So the question is, how do we adapt with to our ability to connect with interactions and other resources to become more and more competitive? A lot of it has to do with what we find in Thomas Buchholz's work in the area of what he calls state styles. Talks about different work styles. I've been kind of in this area. This is the major focus, which is like as you begin to develop a process, the question is, what are things being done that look like people are running through the forest blindfolded, hitting their heads on trees, falling into holes, learning from your mistakes? And this is where I'm at. I'm just learning from my mistakes. I'm having some problems. And then the next point is going to be, as you begin to develop a process, what are things being done that look like people are researching, figuring out best practices, and thinking about how to create a process? Which means you have to find other people, peers, frenemies, other competitors, people that are doing the same types of work that you're doing, and you have to listen to what they're saying. Like there was this young lady, she said something about your uh, your documentation has to have the right format, and there's certain types of format that if you put that into your documentation, then it might be easier to calibrate your AI instance. And then another gentleman said that, you could probably ask your AI agent what's the best way to improve your prompt. These were two great suggestions that people had in order to improve my calibration documentation. Because currently, I want my AI to fix all the problems without any hassle and actually feels like. At some point, hopefully, we'll get to the point where we are testing two types of calibration systems, and then eventually we'll have some set of documents which don't need too much updating anymore. So these are the main areas that I've been teaching over the last several years, and almost no students ever get past this document. When we get into the take inventory section, what is take inventory talking about? All right, take inventory looks like it's still talking about potential. Ah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Goes into state purposes from Tom's book. Then we do some review. It's mostly, and then we go into, yeah, it's a good question about the effectiveness of these documents and how much people actually use them. I would say that this document in general, it's a combination of this work here. Actually, no, this is what we just finished talking about. So this is the next area of the app. This is the first area of the app. This is the next area of the app. The document we just looked at just now, it's actually talking about this area, taking inventory. Yes, that's what it was called, taking inventory. Optimize inventiveness. I've kind of made some changes to it. Yeah, optimize invent. I would say that this is not necessarily important anymore because I've utilized it in a different area. I've also utilized all these things in a different area. I guess this is kind of essential, but I just don't know how to bring it back into the app yet. Yeah, it's already incorporated. Yeah, so it's right now. I'm just gonna keep focusing on this. Maybe in the future I'll create this. This stuff is kind of blurry about what that is actually going to entail. So it means we're still going the right direction. We've had some good experiences with this information, and this is going to be the future. I've been able to explain some methodology. And the last step is what? Is there one thing that I want to pull from this to bring into my actual project? Thinking frameworks. So the final thing is, how can I add more thinking frameworks to my AI calibration? Thank you for joining me this week, and we'll see you on Monday, 10 o'clock in Tbilisi.